You should be afraid of speaking up, but you should be way more afraid of hiding and pretending. The Canadians who are silent when their conscience is telling them to speak should pray that they die before the full consequences of their stupidity make themselves manifest. But they'll have their children to suffer. Their children can suffer for them, because that's really that's the consequences of silence. It's very disruptive to raise your children on a sinking ship. And if you don't think Canada's a sinking ship, you're an idiot. So, you might want to be terrified about speaking up. And fair enough, man. I've had lots of clients who were in a position where their livelihood was threatened by the fact of their beliefs. But there are worse things than losing your job. And you might think, well, that's easy for you to say. It's like, first of all, no, actually, it hasn't been that easy for me to say, although it's been a hell of an adventure. I would just tell people, you don't understand, guys. You're afraid of the wrong thing. Like, if we're in a situation now where you have a job that you can't hold unless you're lying through your silence or your acquiescence, then you either have a lot of house cleaning to do in your particular enterprise, or it's time for you to find a new job. And it couldn't be made more stark than that. And I understand that that's extremely disruptive to people, but I'll tell you what else is disruptive. It's very disruptive to raise your children on a sinking ship. And if you don't think Canada's a sinking ship, you're an idiot. We now make less per capita than people in Mississippi. We're worse off than the people in the worst off state in the US.
Yeah.
It's a race to the bottom. The OECD predicts that we'll be the worst performing country in the developed world for the next 3 decades. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So look, I understand why people are afraid, but you got to be afraid of the right things in life. And the thing you should be afraid of most, this isn't a metaphysical claim. If you lose your integrity, you fall apart. You descend into anxiety. You lose hope. You become weak. You become old. You stress yourself. Your job becomes increasingly pointless. You become bitter and resentful. Like, you're not afraid of that? Well, that's in the future. It's like, yeah, that's for sure. And maybe you lose your job tomorrow. That's possible. But if you stood up and fought, you got up on your back legs and fought, you might find that some people you really admire would come and join you, and maybe you could win. And then maybe your kids could win.
Is Canada really a sinking ship? With alarming predictions and a stark warning about our freedoms, this is a conversation you can't afford to miss.
We're worse off than the people in the worst off state in the US.
Yeah.
It's a race to the bottom. The OECD predicts that we'll be the worst performing country in the developed world for the next 3 decades. I understand why people don't speak up. Canadians do not understand this. Their freedoms are already gone. What we have is we have the remnants of freedoms. We have the echoes and ghosts of freedoms. We have the apparatus of freedom. The freedoms are already gone. And now the consequences of that are going to unfold. Now you can already see that happening in Canada's economic decline, but it's certainly not going to stop there. If you're a Canadian and you think the Charter of Rights protects your rights, you're a fool. That thing isn't worth the paper it's written on. You don't have property rights to any real significant degree. You certainly don't have the right to free speech, especially if you're a professional.
Jordan Peterson has vehemently criticized the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, describing it as worthless in protecting individual liberties, especially when compared to the robust, unwavering protections of the U.S. First Amendment. He argues that under the Charter, freedoms are subject to reasonable limits that can be manipulated by the state, exemplified by the notwithstanding clause, which allows governments to override rights. This, Peterson contends, has left Canadians vulnerable to censorship and professional reprisal for expressing controversial views, starkly contrasting with the American commitment to free speech, where even offensive expressions are fiercely guarded.
The spirit of tyranny has determined how to invade low-level bureaucracies and exert itself. We're protected to some degree against tyranny at the highest levels of the political, but we're not protected at all against creeping tyranny in the administrative state. And especially when the judiciary enables precisely those actors. And they are not responsible to the market as you are if you're a evil capitalist, and they're not responsible to, in any real sense, to the electorate. If that's what people want, if that's by their silence, if that's what they're requesting by their silence, if they're requesting their own slavery by their silence, which is the silence of slaves, by the way, then they'll attract tyranny in precise proportion to that. And you know, it's very hard for Canadians because we are accustomed to assuming that our fundamental institutions are sound, and they were for a long time. You could trust that the political parties essentially stood for what they said they stood for. You didn't have a situation where the Liberals were way left of the NDP, which is certainly the case in Canada now. For example, like people were playing an ideological game, but to the degree that it was possible, they were playing that straight. You could basically, when I grew up, you could basically trust the CBC. You know, certainly some of the journalists at the CBC. The universities were doing a credible job. Even the school systems, which, you know, I hated going to school when I was a kid. I thought that the system was dreadfully incompetent, but now it's staggeringly incompetent. Plus, it's ideologically addled to a degree that is truly diagnosable clinically. And so this isn't going to happen in 10 years. This is now.
Jordan Peterson has argued that the silence and compliance of Canadians have directly contributed to what he perceives as a slide towards authoritarianism, and even a form of slavery under the guise of modern political and cultural norms. He contends that by not vocally defending their rights, Canadians have allowed the government and bureaucratic institutions to incrementally strip away freedoms, particularly freedom of speech, under the pretext of protecting societal harmony or combating hate speech. Peterson sees this passivity as a dangerous capitulation, one that has enabled the enforcement of ideological conformity and the suppression of individual thought.
You know, I watched the universities. Hey, so what happened in the universities? Well, first of all, the administration took over the universities, and that took about 30 years. And the professors stepped back every time they were asked to, until there was really nothing left of them. And then the woke mob took over the administration. And that took about 5 years when they really got going. And now the woke mob is going to take over the sciences too. I mean, that's already more or less a fait accompli. People are 10 years behind the curve fundamentally, or maybe even 15. And so, and I can understand why that is too. It's very hard now to inform yourself properly as to how the world is unfolding, because things are changing at a rate that's just beyond belief. And most people don't know where to get credible information.
Will we continue down this path of silence, or will we reclaim our voices before it's too late? Thanks for watching.